I kind of want to follow up on some of the things that Todd had mentioned, but also what's in the book itself. And that talks about, after 9/11, I think all of law enforcement and the mentality of the DHS enterprise, but really the law enforcement enterprise, pivoted from a reactionary state to a preventive mindset, right? So on the border, what does that mean? Like for years, special agent, responding to the seizures at the border and smuggling organizations smuggling drugs across the border. And let's say that you knew that there was a hole in the fence at the mile marker 1 and 2, and that drug smugglers use that to cross the United States, and you could go sit out there all day long and make case after case after case. After 9/11, that wasn't acceptable anymore, right? We had to find, if there was a hole in the fence, if there was a vulnerability that was being exploited, we had to bend that fence and prevent that and do as much preventive and as we were doing reactionary. And in that mindset is looking at the human smuggling. So HSI's, primary mission is in the lead in the United States is looking at human smuggling organizations. Human smuggling organizations are very different than other criminal organizations, say cartels, drug cartels, who actually are very territorial and they fight amongst each other versus sharing with each other. And that's what you see when we really did a deep dive of all the smuggling organizations, the intelligence that we had about smuggling organizations, is you find that they're more of decentralized organizations that will share resources amongst each other. So if somebody has a really good transportation versus a vessel, they might help out 5 other smuggling organizations with the movement of people by vessel. If they have a way into a country, to maybe it's a loophole or it's a vulnerability that they can exploit, or maybe through corruption, they'll use those services for multiple other organizations. And so it's this network of decentralized organizations all working together to move human cargo from from everywhere from one continent to the next continent, ultimately with the goal of getting to the United States. So what we did is really sat down and looked at, well, if you can't just take out a single organization, how can you make an impact and address those threats before they get to the U.S. border? And we did that by looking at the pathways that these organizations were using. Why did they leave the Horn of Africa and end up someplace in Latin America? Why is that? And was it because there was a weakness in maybe a visa control? Maybe there was maybe it was corruption, that they're exploiting a corrupt official. But we looked at how those pathways actually traveled from the globe through and ultimately up through the southwest border. And then after identifying those pathways, then we looked at and we kind of racked and stacked those organizations that we were going to go after based on the risks that they posed, the national security and public safety risks that they posed. And what does that mean? That means like, all right, well, a lot of organizations, as we all know, when they're smuggling individuals, is they put those individuals or human cargo at great risk. We've seen it where we've had trailer loads of victims who have died from the heat and suffering because they are locked in the back of a tractor trailer as they are crossing the desert. Where they said subjecting them through miles and miles of hiking without any provisions through a desert themselves on foot. Or was the cargo themselves coming from an area that could pose a national security threat, and that these organizations they did not have the same level of admission and consciousness that they were worried about the cargo themselves. And if the person that they may be doing business for today was somebody fleeing in a depressed area, but tomorrow amongst that group was actually somebody who wanted to come here and do us harm, and they were trying to be kind of the needle in the haystack. And as Todd was mentioning, is a lot of people come to this country, and 99% of the people come to this country to live the American dream. But it doesn't mean you close your eyes to the fact is amongst those are people that want to do us harm. And we know that. So to come up with a strategy is what we did, is push our borders out, work with our foreign partners to say, this is why you're seeing the pathway of illegal smuggling coming through your country. and stiffen those controls, mitigate those risks so that they could no longer exploit that area. And then also at the same time is so we could collect as much intelligence about what truly was the intent of the people being brought through that pathway and ultimately into the United States with a goal to get to the United States. That's why I think a lot of the interviews were so important, is they weren't necessarily focusing on to determine if the individual apprehended was a threat themselves, but also what intelligence did they have about the pathway and the ways that they were coming in. Also the foreign country, let's say it was in Syria, during a great part of the time, intelligence about what ISIS was doing when it was unfolding in the beginning was critical information for law enforcement. So it really had a host of different areas that it helped the national security apparatus and the border security apparatus by. One is pushing those interdictions out, helping our partners who, corruption, for example, in your border, if you're a host country, can destabilize you. So how do we help them mitigate that threat? If it's not corruption, maybe it's a weak, like I mentioned before, maybe it's a weak visa restriction that they have, or no visa restrictions, and that is making them a magnet, which can destabilize them as well. And then ultimately, how can we actually just get the intelligence that we need to make sure that we keep the homeland safe before it's too late? There's never a problem until there's a problem. And you talk about, well, what has happened since 9/11 and what has law enforcement done? And a lot of it you cannot quantify. You cannot put down X number of events were prevented, because if you're doing your job right and we're all working together, it's actually the deterrent, right? That prevents that from happening. And yes, people were interdicted. Could they have done something bad? We don't know, because we prevented that from actually having the opportunity to do it. So it's really the preventive side, and from SIA, special interest aliens, which is how the INA defines, somebody unlawfully present in the United States as an alien by the Immigration and Naturalization Act. That's why that term is often used, is why special interest is referred to as the countries that we think could have the greatest nexus to a national security threat. Maybe not that individual, but there obviously, if you're coming out of Syria over the last 10 years, you could have a greater threat related, and if not associated with ISIS, we might have some really good intelligence, just unbeknownst even to yourself, about what was going on in that host country and how we could help combat that threat and work with our foreign partners. So, it's an interesting book, because I think that, as Todd had mentioned, a lot of these things are unknown, and it's not a political situation. This is a national security situation, and a public safety situation, a border security situation, because criminals will find that weakness in our immigration system. They will find that area to exploit, and they will take advantage of it. And they educate people, and they talk to each other about how to take advantage of it. And in today's era, we have to prevent that from happening and eliminate those vulnerabilities. Doesn't mean that we can do it 100% of the time, every time, but you got to be aiming for 100% of the time, every time.